A dirt road outside a small walled town in ancient China. Dust hangs in the still air. Wooden carts stand abandoned in the road, and on every rooftop, in every doorway, in every gap between the mud brick walls, there are people watching. Farmers, merchants, ordinary men and women holding hoes, kitchen knives, hunting bows, anything that can be swung or thrown. In the middle of the road stands a small group of travelers, scholars, not soldiers. They carry scrolls, not swords, and they are surrounded. 5 years ago, this town, called Kuang, was attacked by a warlord named Yang Hu, a man who burned homes and killed without mercy. The people of Kuang have not forgotten his face. Today, they believe they are looking at it again. An old man stands at the front of the group. Tall, unusually tall, taller than almost anyone the townspeople have ever seen, gray-bearded, calm in a way that makes no sense given the circumstances. His name is Kong Chu. History will call him Confucius. And right now, a mob of frightened, furious townspeople is certain he is the man who destroyed their homes. One of his students, a fierce, broad-shouldered young man named Zilu, who was once something close to a street brawler before this old man ever got hold of him, grips the hilt of his sword. He has fought before. He could fight now. But fighting means killing people who have made an honest, understandable mistake. And even if they broke free, they would spend the rest of their lives hunted as murderers across the countryside. There is no good option. So the old man does something no one expects. He sits down in the dust of the road. He reaches for a small wooden instrument resting across his lap, a stringed zither, called a chin. And in the middle of a siege, surrounded by people who might kill him within the hour, Confucius begins to play music. His students stare at him. Someone finally asks a question hanging in the air. How can you be calm right now? Confucius answers with a question of his own. After King Wen died, he says, wasn't the treasure of our civilization's culture placed in my hands? If heaven intended for that culture to be destroyed, I would never have been entrusted with it in the first place. And if heaven does not intend for it to be destroyed, then what exactly can the people of this town do to me? The music continues, thin and steady, floating out over a crowd that came here to kill a warlord and instead found an old teacher playing a song. We do not know yet whether this is the moment he dies. Neither did he. But this is not where our story begins. To understand why a man would choose to play music instead of begging for his life, we have to go back more than 60 years earlier to the birth of a fatherless boy in a small, unremarkable town in a kingdom that was slowly tearing itself apart. To understand Confucius, you first have to understand the world he was born into, because almost everything he ever taught was an answer, a direct, deliberate answer to what was happening around him. 2,500 years ago, China was not one country. It was more than 100 small kingdoms and states, all technically loyal to a king who ruled from a city called Luoyang, a king from a royal family known as the Zhou. Centuries earlier, the Zhou kings had claimed something called the mandate of heaven, the idea that a ruler holds power only because heaven itself has chosen him, and that a ruler who becomes cruel or corrupt can lose that mandate and lose his throne along with it. It was, in its own way, one of the first ideas in human history to say that even kings answer to something higher than themselves. It was a beautiful idea. By the time Confucius was born, it was mostly just a memory. The Zhou king still technically sat on his throne, but he had almost no real power left. The actual rulers of China were dozens of dukes and lords, each commanding his own state, each with his own army, and each one, more often than not, at war with his neighbors. Historians would later name this era the Spring and Autumn period, and it earned that gentle, peaceful-sounding name only because a far bloodier one, the Warring States period, was still to come. The violence was not occasional. It was constant. Armies crossed borders without warning. Cities were sacked. In the courts of these small kingdoms, assassination had become an ordinary tool of politics. Sons plotting against fathers for a throne, brothers turning on brothers, advisers executed for telling their lord an uncomfortable truth, while flatterers who told him only what he wanted to hear were promoted and rewarded. Something else was crumbling too, and it mattered just as much to the story you're about to hear. Ritual. For centuries, Chinese society had been held together by an enormous, intricate web of ceremonies. How to greet a guest, how to bury a parent, how a minister should bow to his lord, how a son should speak to his father, even the exact music that should be played at a state banquet. These rituals weren't simply good manners, they were the glue holding an entire civilization together, a shared language of respect and obligation that let millions of people live near one another without constantly tearing each other apart. By the 6th century BC, that glue was failing. Nobles still performed the ancient ceremonies, the bowing, the music, the sacrifices to their ancestors, but increasingly the ceremonies had become hollow. Lords who plotted murder in the morning could perform a flawless ritual of respect that same afternoon. They invoked heaven while breaking every oath they had ever sworn. The forms remained. The meaning had drained out of them, the way water drains slowly from cracked ground. Into this fractured world, a world where almost everyone who held power had stopped believing in the rules they claimed to follow, a boy was born who would spend his entire life obsessed with one enormous question. How do people live together without destroying each other? He would never command an army. He would never rule a kingdom. When he died, by nearly every measure his own society used to judge success, he would consider himself a failure. And yet, 2,500 years later, more than 1.5 billion people across China, Korea, Japan, and Vietnam still shape their daily lives, in ways large and small, around the answer he spent his life trying to give. This is the story of Confucius. Confucius is not actually his real name. His birth name was Kong-Chu. Confucius is a Latinized version of an honorific his students used, Kong-Fuzi, meaning Great Master Kong, a name coined by European missionaries who reached China nearly 2,000 years after he lived. For his entire life, and for centuries afterward, no one who actually knew him ever called him Confucius. His father was a man named Shuliang-he, a soldier and minor official in the small eastern state of Lu. Shuliang-he was already something of a local legend, famous for a single moment of extraordinary strength. Years earlier, during a military siege, he had been among a group of soldiers who rushed through an enemy city's open gates, only to realize, too late, that it was a trap. The gate began to fall shut behind them, closing his men inside with the enemy, Shuliang. He caught the falling gate with his bare hands and held it open by force, long enough for his soldiers to escape, before slipping free himself at the very last moment. By the time Confucius was born, that heroic soldier was an old man, already deep into his 60s, with grown daughters from an earlier marriage, but no healthy son to carry on the family's name and responsibilities. So he sought a new wife, a teenager named Yan Zhengzai, the youngest of 3 sisters from a neighboring family. The match was unusual, a man in his 60s marrying a girl barely out of childhood, and it caused some quiet scandal, even at the time. There is a story, one of many legends that grew up around Confucius's life, that before he was born, his mother traveled to a nearby mountain to pray for the son she so badly wanted. In a dream, she is said to have encountered a qilin, a mythical creature, something like a unicorn crossed with a dragon, believed in ancient China to appear only at moments of enormous historical importance. The qilin told her she would give birth to an uncrowned king, a person destined for greatness, though never for a throne. We can never know for certain whether that dream really happened, or whether it was a story added later by people who already knew how extraordinary this child would become. Almost every great figure in ancient history has a legend like this attached to their birth. What we do know for certain is what happened next, and it was not the beginning of a fairy tale. It was the beginning of a very hard life. Kong-Chu was born in 551 BC, and when he was only 3 years old, his father died. His mother was left to raise him almost entirely alone, and there is real reason to believe she did so without much help, or even acceptance, from her husband's family. According to the oldest surviving accounts of his life, she never told her son where his father was buried, possibly because she herself had been shut out of the funeral entirely. Try to imagine that for a moment. Growing up without even knowing where your own father rests, unable to perform the respectful ceremonies a son was expected to carry out at his father's grave, ceremonies that, in his world, defined what it meant to be a good and honorable son. It left a mark on him that never fully faded. As a small child, with no real ritual vessels of his own to practice with, He is said to have played with ordinary household bowls and plates, arranging them the way priests arrange sacred offerings, quietly rehearsing, alone, the ceremonies of respect he had been denied the chance to perform for real. That single detail tells you almost everything about the boy this would become. By all accounts, though, his childhood was not without love. His mother, young herself, barely out of her teens when he was born, poured everything she had into raising him. Confucius later spoke of a home where warmth and mutual respect mattered enormously, even when money did not. That early experience of family devotion, built inside hardship rather than comfort, would become one of the cornerstones of everything he later taught the world about how families, and by extension entire societies, should hold together. Poverty followed Confucius through his childhood, and he never pretended otherwise. In his own later teaching, he openly admitted that his family's hardship had forced him, from a young age, to learn how to do many different kinds of practical work, simply to survive. There is a story from his teenage years that stung him for the rest of his life. A powerful noble family in Lu, the Ji clan, hosted a grand feast, and a young Confucius, hoping to attend, was turned away at the door. Not because of anything he had done, because, a servant told him bluntly, he was not a gentleman. His plain clothes, his low standing, his poverty, all of it had been read at a glance, before he ever said a single word. He never forgot it. And later in life, he would become one of history's fiercest voices against exactly this idea, the notion that a person's worth should be decided by their birth rather than by their character. At 15 years old, Confucius later said he made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He committed himself completely to learning. The very first line recorded in the Analects, the collection of his sayings, written down by his students long after his death, captures this spirit perfectly. In simple modern words, isn't it a joy to learn something and then in time to put it into practice? For a boy who owned almost nothing else in the world, learning was something no one could ever take away from him. He studied what were known as the 6 arts, the complete education expected of any respectable young man in ancient China: ritual and ceremony, music, archery, horse and chariot driving, calligraphy, and mathematics. Most children of his low social standing would never have had real access to this kind of education at all. Confucius pursued it anyway, relentlessly, attending local public schools where he could, teaching himself the rest, questioning any visiting scholar or official who might know something he did not. He is even said to have studied ritual with one master, music with another, and the lute with a third, gathering fragments of knowledge from wherever he could find them. Like a boy building an entire house, one borrowed brick at a time. Confucius stood well over 6 feet tall. Some ancient accounts claim closer to 7, an enormous height for anyone in the ancient world, let alone in ancient China. Ancient writers loved to exaggerate the physical size of great men as a way of hinting at their greatness, so we can't be entirely certain of the exact number. But every source agrees on this much. He was strikingly unusually tall, a presence that filled a room before he ever said a word. He was not a natural genius who effortlessly absorbed everything around him. He was something rarer, and in some ways far more admirable, a boy who simply refused to stop learning, no matter how many doors closed in his face, no matter how many feasts he was turned away from. Here is something worth sitting with, if you are 10 years old and have ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or left out because of where you started. Confucius was never given anything. Everything he became, he built himself, one lesson at a time, out of pure stubborn curiosity. That is not a small thing. That may, in the end, be the most important thing about him. At 19, Confucius married a young woman from the Chiguan clan from the neighboring state of Song. The following year, they had a son. When the boy was born, the Duke of Lu, already aware of this promising, unusually learned young man, sent the family a gift, a live carpfish. It was a small honor, but for a poor household it meant a great deal, and Confucius named his son in celebration of it, Kong Li, meaning carp, with the nickname Boyu, or elder fish, a fish sent by a duke, folded permanently into a father's pride and a son's name. Confucius and his wife would go on to have at least 2 daughters as well, though the historical record says frustratingly little about them, a silence that says something, in its own way, about how ancient Chinese sources tended to remember daughters far less carefully than sons. His early career was nothing glamorous. He worked first as a keeper of granaries, carefully counting and recording stored grain, and later as an overseer of livestock and of fields. Humble government jobs, the kind typically handed to a capable but unconnected young man with no powerful family standing behind him. He did the work with unusual precision. Even in these small, unglamorous roles, people began to notice something distinctive about him. A seriousness, an insistence on doing even boring, thankless tasks exactly the right way, simply because it was the right way to do them. By his early 20s, his diligence had already earned him a promotion to chief overseer, working for a powerful nobleman of the Ji clan. A striking rise for a young man who, a few years earlier, hadn't even been allowed through the door of that same family's feast. Not long after, tragedy struck again. His mother died. Following the ancient tradition of mourning, Confucius withdrew from public life for 3 full years, a long, quiet period of grief, reflection, and deepening study. 3 years is a long time to step away from the world. Some of Confucius's own students, later in his life, would openly question whether such a long period of mourning was really necessary, whether it wasn't, in practical terms, simply wasteful. Confucius's answer to them was sharp and unhesitating. Your parents held and cared for you, without complaint, for the first 3 years of your life, before you could do anything at all for yourself. Is it truly too much to give them 3 years of mourning in return, at the end of theirs? This was the beginning of what Confucius would later call xiao, or filial piety, the deep, active respect and gratitude owed to one's parents. In simple terms, the people who raised you and sacrificed for you deserve your care, not only when it's easy or convenient, but always, and especially when it costs you something. It might sound old-fashioned to modern ears, but ask yourself honestly, how do you treat the people who take care of you on the ordinary days when no one is watching? Confucius believed that was one of the very first places a person's true character could be seen. By the time he finally emerged from mourning, Confucius was a young man in his mid-20s, poor still, but increasingly respected, known already as someone who understood the old rituals more deeply than almost anyone else in Lu. Small groups of young men had begun approaching him on their own, asking, hesitantly, whether he might be willing to teach them. He was about to build something China had never quite seen before. Here is something that might genuinely surprise you. In Confucius's time, education belonged almost entirely to the rich. If your family had money and noble status, you could hire private tutors. If you didn't, you learned nothing beyond how to survive. China, at this point in its long history, did not yet have anything resembling a real school. Confucius decided to build one anyway. His own words on the subject, put simply, in education there should be no distinctions of class. He didn't care whether a student's father was a duke or a farmer. He cared only whether that student was willing to work hard and be honest with himself. His tuition was, quite deliberately, a symbol rather than a fortune, a small bundle of dried meat, something almost any family, however poor, could scrape together. Wealthy students studied side by side with poor ones. Students who lived too far away to travel back and forth were even invited to live in Confucius's own home. What mattered to him wasn't where a student had started. It was how honestly he was willing to examine his own weaknesses and how hard he was willing to work to overcome them. He taught in a style that would feel strikingly modern in a classroom today, closer, in many ways, to the questioning method used by the Greek philosopher Socrates, who lived at almost exactly the same time on the other side of the world, though the two men never knew of each other's existence. Confucius didn't simply lecture at his students. He questioned them, pushed them, and sometimes deliberately let them sit in frustrated silence until they worked out an answer for themselves. He paid close attention to each student's individual temperament, and he taught each one differently because of it. 2 students once asked him the exact same question: should a person act immediately on a good idea the moment they learn it? Confucius gave them completely opposite answers. To one, a cautious, hesitant young man, he said, "Act at once, don't overthink it." To the other, a bold, impulsive young man, he said, "Slow down. First talk it over with your father and your elder brothers." When a third student, watching this, asked in confusion why the master had contradicted himself, Confucius explained patiently that he hadn't contradicted himself at all. He had simply given each young man exactly the push he personally needed. One needed courage, the other needed restraint. That was the true heart of his teaching, not a single rule handed down for everyone alike, but a patient, careful attention to who each person actually was. His relationship with his students was less like a formal teacher and pupils, and closer, by all accounts, to something like a father with many sons. He never believed that harsh punishment or humiliation made for good teaching. Instead, he inspired something rarer, real loyalty. Even his most difficult, hot-tempered student, Zilu, the former street brawler who would one day stand beside him in the siege at Kuang, came, over time, to regard Confucius as the greatest man he had ever known. Out of these years of patient teaching, a handful of core ideas took shape, ideas that would eventually be gathered together under the name Confucianism, though Confucius himself would very likely have objected to that name, since he always insisted he wasn't inventing anything new, only carefully passing along the wisdom of the ancients. The most important of these ideas was Ren, a word that doesn't translate cleanly into English, but which points toward something like benevolence, or a deep, active kindness and empathy toward other people. Confucius taught that Ren wasn't reserved for the powerful, or the noble-born, or even for one's own family and friends. True Ren, he said, extended outward to everyone, the understanding that all people, rich or poor, deserve to have their suffering noticed and their well-being cared about. Then came Li, ritual, propriety, the respectful and appropriate way of behaving toward others in every kind of relationship, how a ruler should treat his people, how parents and children should treat one another, how friends should speak to each other. Yi meant righteousness, doing what is right even when it costs you something, even when it would be easier and safer to look away. Ji meant wisdom, not just cleverness, but genuine understanding of what the right thing to do actually is in a given moment. Confucius taught his students that wisdom could be gained in 3 different ways. The first and noblest was reflection, sitting quietly and thinking things through for yourself. The second and easiest was imitation, watching wise people and learning by copying them. The third and hardest was experience, simply living through hard things and learning, often painfully, from what happened. All 3 mattered, he said, but he warned his students never to rely only on the easiest path. And Shin meant integrity, being honest, being someone whose word could always be trusted, keeping your promises even when no one would ever know if you broke them. Rising above all of these, tying them together, was Confucius's picture of the kind of person everyone should try to become, the junzi, often translated as the noble person, or the true gentleman. Before Confucius, that word had simply meant a man born into a noble family, nothing more, nothing earned. Confucius redefined it completely. To him, a junzi wasn't a person born into greatness. It was a person who had earned greatness, through discipline, through honesty, through a daily deliberate choice to act with kindness and integrity, regardless of where they had started in life. Confucius described 9 things you could watch for to recognize a true junzi. When he looks, he sees clearly, without letting his own biases twist what's in front of him. When he listens, he actually hears what is being said, instead of twisting the speaker's words to suit himself. His expression is kind, his manner is respectful, his speech is careful and sincere. When he doubts something, he is not too proud to ask questions. When he is angry, he thinks about the consequences before he acts, instead of lashing out. And when he sees a chance for personal gain, he pauses first to ask whether taking it would be right. Confucius set this standard opposite a very different kind of man, the xiaoren, the small person, who is arrogant, undisciplined, and interested only in what benefits himself. Think for a moment about what this meant in a world where nobility was simply handed to you at birth, no matter how you behaved. Confucius was telling a room full of poor students, farmers' sons, merchants' sons, boys turned away from feasts for not being gentlemen, something quietly radical. You are not stuck being what you were born into. Through your own effort, you can become a genuinely excellent human being. It remains one of the most powerful ideas in human history, the belief that character is not inherited. It is built, brick by brick, choice by choice. His school grew, Word of this poor, remarkably learned teacher began to spread across Lu, and soon it reached the court itself. For a while, it genuinely seemed as though Confucius's ideas might get their chance. Sometime in his 40s or early 50s, he was appointed magistrate of a small town called Zhongdu. By nearly every account, he governed it with striking success, fair laws, honest markets, and orderly, mutually respectful community that neighboring towns in Lu soon began quietly copying. His reputation climbed quickly. Within only a year or two, he was promoted to Minister of Works, overseeing public building projects, agriculture, and road construction across the state. Not long after that, he was promoted again, this time to one of the most powerful and demanding positions in all of Lu, Minister of Justice, effectively the state's highest judge, presiding personally over its most important legal cases. Sima Qian, the great ancient historian who wrote the most detailed early account of Confucius's life, claims that within just 3 months in this role, corruption among merchants had all but vanished, the streets had become safe, and travelers could pass through Lu's markets without fear of being cheated. That's almost certainly an exaggeration. Later generations of admiring students loved to polish Confucius's achievements into something closer to legend than fact, but even allowing for the exaggeration, something real was happening. A poor scholar's son, once turned away at a nobleman's door for not being a gentleman, had climbed, through nothing but ability and reputation, into one of the highest offices in his home state. His greatest single triumph came in the year 500 BC, at a diplomatic meeting between Lu and its powerful, often hostile neighbor, the state of Qi. The two dukes met at a place called Jiagu to negotiate, but Confucius, accompanying his own duke as chief advisor, suspected that Qi was planning something underhanded, and had already convinced his duke to bring senior military officials along, just in case. He was right to be cautious. In the middle of the meeting, the Duke of Qi ordered his soldiers to perform what was announced as a ceremonial dance, except the dancers carried real weapons, and the entire display was clearly meant to intimidate the Lu delegation. Confucius did not flinch. He stepped forward and calmly informed the Duke of Qi that armed performers had no place at a peaceful diplomatic gathering, and that staging one now made it plain Qi was not negotiating in good faith. It was a bold, even dangerous thing to say directly to a foreign ruler in front of his own soldiers. But it worked. Embarrassed and exposed, the Duke of Qi backed down, and by the end of the negotiations, Qi had agreed to return several towns it had previously seized from Lu by force, without a single sword having been drawn on either side. Confucius had won a real, lasting victory for his home state, not with an army, not with a single drop of blood spilled, but with calm words spoken at exactly the right moment. It's worth pausing on that. He had proven something he had been teaching for years, that real courage doesn't always look like a sword raised in battle. Sometimes it looks like standing your ground in a room full of people who could hurt you, and simply, steadily, telling the truth. He was even asked directly once what he believed a good government truly needed. Confucius answered that 3 things mattered most: enough food to feed the people, enough weapons to defend the state, and above all, the trust and confidence of the people themselves. Pressed on which of the 3 he would sacrifice first if forced to choose, he answered, the weapons. Pressed again on which of the remaining 2 he would give up, he answered, even the food, because he said, death has always come, eventually, to every person who has ever lived. But a government that has lost the trust of its own people has lost everything that actually holds a state together. For the first time in his life, Confucius held real power and real influence at the highest level of his home state's government, and he was about to use it to attempt the single most dangerous reform of his career. For generations, the true power in Lu had never really belonged to the duke. It belonged to 3 powerful noble families, the Ji, the Meng, and the Shu clans, each of whom kept their own private armies and sheltered safely behind the walls of their own heavily fortified towns. The Duke of Lu, in practice, was a ruler in name only, hemmed in on every side by families more powerful than he was. Confucius saw this clearly, and he proposed something bold, even reckless. Tear down the private fortifications of all 3 clans, and disband their private armies, leaving the Duke as the only ruler in Lu with a fortified city and real military strength standing behind him. It was an enormous gamble, a direct, open challenge to the very families who held the real power in the state. Confucius sent his own most loyal student, the fierce and steady Zilu, to help carry out the plan on the ground. 2 of the 3 clans, the Shu and eventually the Ji, complied, but when Lu's forces tried to tear down the walls of the 3rd clan, the Meng, they refused outright and successfully defended their fortress even after the Duke himself personally led troops against it. The reform stalled, half-finished, half-successful, and entirely dangerous. It had consequences no one in Lu had fully anticipated. In the rival state of Qi, officials watched Confucius's growing influence with real alarm. If Lu's duke succeeded in unifying control over his own state's military, Qi would suddenly be facing a far more dangerous, unified neighbor. So Qi's ministers devised a plan, not an army, not open war, but something quieter, and in its own way, far more effective. They sent the Duke of Lu a gift, fine horses and troops of beautiful dancing girls. It worked exactly as intended. The Duke, seduced by the gift, began neglecting his official duties, skipping court meetings, ignoring the ceremonies and responsibilities of governing, losing himself in pleasure, while the actual business of the state was left to drift unattended for days at a time. Confucius watched this happen, and without dramatics, without a single public complaint or accusation, he made his decision. He quietly gathered his things and left the court he had served faithfully for years. A messenger from the powerful Ji clan caught up with him on the road and begged him to return. Confucius refused, rebuking, as he went, the nobles of Lu for abandoning their duties for the sake of dancing girls and fine horses. And then he continued walking away from the only real political power he had ever held. It's worth sitting with that moment for a second. Confucius had spent his entire life climbing toward exactly this kind of influence, a genuine position, real power, an actual chance to put his ideas into practice at the highest level of government. And when it finally came down to a choice between keeping that power and walking away from a ruler who had lost his integrity, Confucius did not hesitate. He chose to walk. He was 56 years old. He had no home waiting for him elsewhere, no position lined up, and absolutely no guarantee that any ruler in China would ever offer him a role like this again. He would spend the next 14 years finding out. What followed was one of the longest, hardest journeys in the history of philosophy. More than a decade of wandering from state to state across ancient China, searching for a single ruler willing to govern not through fear and force, but through virtue. He never found one. Picture the road itself, not a paved highway, a rough dirt track, dusty in summer, freezing mud in winter, winding between one small warring kingdom and the next. You are one of the small group of students who chose to follow this old teacher into uncertainty, giving up comfortable homes and safe futures in Lu to sleep in unfamiliar inns, eat whatever food you could find along the way, and carry nothing forward except the belief that somewhere, eventually, the right door would finally open. His first stop was the state of Wei, where Duke Ling welcomed him warmly and even matched the salary he had earned back in Lu. For a while, it seemed genuinely promising. Confucius engaged the Duke and his officials in long, passionate discussions about virtuous leadership, and for a moment it looked as though he had finally found his opening. But critics at the Wei court whispered against him, wary of a newcomer's growing influence, and after only about 10 months, Confucius chose to move on. He traveled on to the state of Song, where the ruler proved far less receptive, brushing off his ideas about social harmony despite his best efforts. Dejected but undeterred, Confucius pressed on to the state of Zheng, where for a time he found a more eager audience, officials genuinely interested in what his philosophy might offer their troubled society. It was in Zheng, worn down by the road, that Confucius was once separated from his own students entirely, wandering the unfamiliar streets alone until they finally found him again. One bystander who saw him standing there, tired and lost, is said to have described him, not unkindly, as looking rather like a stray dog outside a great house, unmistakably dignified and yet utterly without a home. When his students later told him what the man had said, Confucius reportedly laughed, quietly, and admitted it was probably true. Somewhere on this long road, tradition holds that Confucius once traveled to the ancient Zhou capital of Luoyang, and there met a man who would become one of the other towering figures of Chinese thought, Laozi, the founder of what would become known as Taoism, then serving as a royal court archivist. The two philosophers could hardly have been more different. Confucius believed passionately in ritual, structure, and the deliberate, disciplined effort to become a better person. Laozi believed in flowing naturally with the Tao, the way, trusting the world's own quiet rhythms rather than fighting to control them. Laozi is said to have looked at the eager, earnest scholar in front of him and offered a warning rather than a blessing that Confucius's insistence on proper ritual and correct behavior counted for very little in a world where rulers performed the old ceremonies out of empty habit rather than real understanding, and that a man who kept insisting on doing things the right way would inevitably make powerful enemies. Laozi was right. Confucius made enemies almost everywhere he went, not because he was cruel or arrogant or difficult, but because he refused to simply tell powerful men what they wanted to hear. One of the strangest episodes of the entire journey happened back in Wei. Duke Ling's wife, Lady Nanzi, held a scandalous reputation at court. When she sent Confucius a formal summons to appear before her, his fierce disciple Zilu was appalled, certain his teacher shouldn't go anywhere near her. But Confucius went anyway, explaining that proper duty required him to answer a summons, regardless of his private feelings about the person issuing it. When Zilu confronted him afterward, upset and suspicious, Confucius answered with something close to a solemn oath. If he had done anything improper in that meeting, he said, "May heaven itself abandon me." It's a small moment, but it tells you something important about how Confucius actually lived. He cared enormously about how his choices looked, not out of vanity, but because he believed a person's outward conduct and their inward character should always match. There should be no gap, however small, between the two. Year after year, state after state, the same painful pattern repeated itself. Confucius would arrive in a new capital. Sometimes an introduction to the ruler came quickly. Sometimes it took months of patient waiting. When the audience finally happened, he would explain his philosophy, the importance of virtue, the quiet power of proper ritual, the transformation that patient, honest governance could bring about over time. Some rulers listened with genuine curiosity, asking real questions, seeming truly engaged, and then thanked him politely and went straight back to their wars. Others found the old philosopher merely eccentric, entertaining in small doses, ultimately irrelevant to what they considered the serious business of power. A few saw in his teaching an implicit criticism of everything they had done to seize and hold their thrones, and turned actively hostile. It was also during these long, exhausting years of wandering that Confucius and his small, weary band of students walked directly into the two closest calls of his entire life. The siege at Kuang you already witnessed at the very beginning of this story, and something even harder still, waiting for them further down the road. You already know how the siege at Kuang began. Confucius mistaken for the warlord Yang Hu, surrounded by an armed and terrified town, calmly playing music while his students feared for their lives. Here is how it ended. For 5 days, the standoff held. No one attacked. No one was allowed to leave. And then, finally, someone arrived in Kuang who had actually seen Yang Hu's face in person and confirmed what Confucius's students already knew in their hearts. The resemblance was only superficial. This tall old scholar with the chin was not the warlord who had destroyed their town years before. The siege dissolved. Confucius and his students walked out of Kuang unharmed. Whether his calm during those 5 days had come from genuine, unshakable faith, or simply from an old man who had already lost so much that he had little left to fear, is a question no ancient source can fully answer. Perhaps even Confucius himself never knew for certain. What he did know was this: he had faced death without panic, and he was still alive to keep teaching. But Kuang, terrifying as it was, would not be the hardest trial of the journey. That one still waited ahead, in the empty country between two small, frightened states named Chen and Tai. Picture it. You are one of Confucius's students, walking a dusty road on the border between these two small states. Neither Chen nor Kai wants a famous, outspoken philosopher advising their rival. So instead of arresting your group outright or attacking it, soldiers from both states simply surround you in open wilderness, cutting off every road in and out. No violence, no demands, just silence and hunger. 7 days pass. There is no food and no way to get more. Around you, the other students, men who left comfortable lives in Lu years ago, who have followed this teacher across half of China, through rejection after rejection, believing that eventually the right opportunity would surely emerge, are growing weaker by the hour. Some can no longer stand, and a question that has been quietly building for years finally breaks out into the open. Zilu, Confucius's oldest and most devoted student, comes to him, not gently, but almost as an open accusation. Does even the noble person suffer like this? If Confucius's teachings were true, if virtue really mattered, if heaven truly favored the good, then why were they starving in a ditch while cruel, dishonest men feasted safely behind palace walls night after night? Why had every single door, in state after state, year after year, closed in their faces? Confucius answers without hesitation. The noble person, he says, remains steady in hardship. It is the small-minded person who in hardship loses all self-control. It is not an excuse. It is not even really comfort. It is a distinction. Suffering, Confucius is telling him, comes to everyone, the good and the wicked alike. No one is protected from hunger or grief or failure simply for trying to be a good person. What separates people isn't whether hardship arrives, it's what they choose to do once it does. A person without principle, faced with real suffering, will abandon those principles the moment it becomes convenient. Lying, cheating, betraying anyone at all, if it means the pain might stop. A person of true character holds on to who they are, even when holding on costs them everything they have left. It is a hard answer. Zilu is not fully satisfied by it. A philosophy, however true, does not fill an empty stomach. And in the middle of the crisis, as his students grow weaker around him, Confucius asks a question of his own, half joking, half something much closer to real doubt. Am I a bitter gourd, good for nothing but hanging decoratively on a string, never to be eaten, never of any actual use to anyone? It is one of the only moments in the entire historical record where Confucius sounds, even briefly, uncertain of himself. A lifetime of rejection, state after state, ruler after ruler turning him away, had finally caught up with him, if only for a moment, in the middle of that starving wilderness. They survived. Allies eventually broke through and brought relief, but something inside the group had shifted. Confucius was growing old, his body was tired, and door after door kept closing in front of him, no matter how far he walked or how patiently he waited. He kept walking anyway. At 68 years old, after roughly 14 years of wandering, rejection, and near disaster, Confucius finally returned home to Lu, invited back at last by the state's chief minister. He never did find the virtuous ruler he had spent his life searching for. In the eyes of nearly every court he had visited, he had failed at the one goal he'd pursued hardest, gaining enough political power to actually put his ideas into practice on a truly large scale. But something else had happened along the way, almost without his noticing. He had become the single most respected teacher in China. Back in Lu, he devoted his final years almost entirely to teaching and to preserving the wisdom of the past for the generations still to come. His school had grown to an extraordinary size by now. Tradition holds he taught as many as 3,000 students over the course of his lifetime, with a core group of around 72 especially devoted senior disciples who studied most closely alongside him, argued with him, and would eventually write down his words for everyone who came after. He spent these final years editing and compiling what would come to be known as the 5 Classics. The Book of Songs gathered more than 300 poems and hymns from across China, folk songs about love and loss, courtly odes praising noble deeds, ceremonial hymns for great state occasions, which Confucius believed trained the heart and refined a person's sense of what was right, long before any formal lesson ever needed to be spoken aloud. The Book of Documents preserved the speeches and records of ancient virtuous kings, offering living models of what good government could actually look like. The Book of Rites set down in careful detail the meaning behind every ceremony Confucius had spent his life defending, not just what to do, but why it mattered. The Book of Changes, an ancient and famously difficult text used for divination, fascinated him so deeply in his final years that, according to tradition, the leather straps binding his personal copy wore through and had to be replaced 3 separate times from constant use. He is said to have remarked that if heaven granted him another 50 years of life, he would spend every one of them still trying to fully understand it. And the spring and autumn annals recorded, in spare, careful language, the history of his own home state of Lu, a chronicle in which, tradition claims, Confucius embedded subtle moral judgments in his precise choice of words, praising or quietly condemning long-dead rulers through the smallest shifts in phrasing. Confucius always insisted, throughout his life, that he had never invented any of this wisdom himself. "I transmit, but I do not create," he told his students. "I trust in and love the ancient ways." He did not see himself as a genius producing brand new ideas. He saw himself as something more modest, and in its own way far more remarkable, a bridge carrying the best wisdom of the past safely into the future, so that it would not be lost in an age that seemed determined to forget it. One of his students, a young man named Zeng, once asked him directly whether there was a single word, just one, that could serve as a guide for an entire lifetime. Confucius answered with a word that is usually translated as reciprocity, and then explained what he meant by it in a single sentence that has echoed across the world ever since. "Do not do to others what you would not want done to yourself." Notice something interesting about the way he phrased it. Many traditions have a version of this same idea, often called the Golden Rule, but most versions tell you to act. Treat others the way you would like to be treated. Confucius's version is quieter and in some ways humbler. It doesn't command you to guess what kindness someone else might want. It simply asks you to pause before you act and ask yourself one honest question. Would I want this done to me? If the answer is no, don't do it. It is restraint before it is generosity. And it turns out, remarkably, that almost every major ethical tradition on earth, from ancient Israel to India to the peoples of Africa and the Americas, arrived independently at some version of this exact same idea. When a single insight shows up again and again in cultures that had never spoken to one another, it is probably touching something true about what it actually takes for human beings to live together. For the first time in decades, Confucius had something close to peace. His students surrounded him. His life's work, not political power, but wisdom, carefully gathered and carefully passed on, was finally taking a shape that might outlast him. And then, one after another, he began to lose the people he loved most. The final years of Confucius's life brought him more grief than almost any other stretch of his long, difficult journey. His son, Boyu, died at around 50 years old, never a particularly distinguished student himself, mentioned only once in the entire Analects, but Confucius's own child nonetheless, gone before the father. Confucius, by now an old man himself, presided quietly over a modest funeral for his son. Around this same time, he became a grandfather. His daughter-in-law gave birth to a boy named Kong Ji, who would grow up to become a respected philosopher in his own right, carrying his grandfather's tradition forward into the next generation. It was a small, quiet comfort amid deepening loss. Then came word of Zilu, the fierce, loyal, hot-tempered student who had followed Confucius through years of exile, through the siege at Kuang, through the starvation between Chen and Chai. Zilu had gone on to serve as a minister in the state of Wei, and he was killed defending his ruler during a sudden, violent uprising. Ancient accounts tell us that even as he lay mortally wounded, Zilu paused to calmly retie the cords of his ceremonial hat, insisting, even in his very last moments, on dying with the same dignity and proper conduct he had spent his life learning at his teacher's side. Confucius had recently quarreled with Zilu over his conduct as a minister in Wei. It did not matter now. The grief was just as real. But nothing, not even Zilu's death, compared to the loss that came next. Yan Wei, Confucius's favorite and most brilliant student, the one he had quietly hoped might one day lead his school after he was gone, died suddenly in his early 30s. Confucius had once described Yanhui this way: "I can talk with him all day, and he never disagrees with me, as if he were a fool. But when he leaves, and I observe how he actually lives his life, I find that he understands everything perfectly." It was the highest praise Confucius ever gave to any student, not for clever arguments, but for quietly, faithfully living out everything he had been taught. Losing Yan Hui broke something in the old teacher that nothing else in his long, hard life had managed to break. When his other students gently suggested that his grief seemed excessive, Confucius asked them, simply, "If not for a man like this, then for whom should a person grieve deeply?" Not long before these deaths, in the year 481 BC, Confucius had been asked to help identify a strange, unfamiliar animal that hunters had captured. Looking closely at it, he recognized the creature from the old legend of his own birth, a qilin, the very same mythical animal said to have appeared to his mother more than 70 years earlier, foretelling the birth of an uncrowned king. Now, near the very end of his own life, the qilin had returned, and in Chinese tradition, the qilin appears not only to herald the birth of a great sage, it appears too to foretell his death. Confucius wept at the sight of it. In the last days of his life, according to tradition, Confucius rose early one morning, as he always did, and walked slowly, leaning on a stick, to the door of his house. He stood in the doorway, looking out, and began to sing quietly to himself, a fragment of an old verse about a great mountain slowly crumbling, and a strong wooden beam quietly rotting away, and a wise man withering, in time, just like any plant. One of his students, hearing him, understood at once what the old man was telling them. "The master," he said softly to the others, "must be preparing to die." Confucius did not deny it. He went back inside and sat facing the door, the exact posture he had held for decades, greeting students who came to him to learn. He died in the spring of 479 BC at around 72 years old. By nearly every measure his own world used to judge success, Confucius had failed. He never held the kind of lasting power he had spent his entire adult life pursuing. No great king had ever fully adopted his teachings and built a kingdom around them. He died, by his own private estimate, without having achieved the one goal that had driven him his whole life. But watch now what happened next. His students, men who had followed him through exile, through hunger, through siege, through year after year of rejection, gathered at his grave and mourned him for 3 full years, the traditional period of mourning owed to a father. A simple mourning hut was built near the burial site, and several disciples took up residence there, living simply for the entire 3 years, exactly as their teacher had once mourned his own mother. One of his closest students, Zigong, a wealthy, sharp-tongued diplomat, someone Confucius had sometimes gently worried had more cleverness than depth, stayed even longer than the rest, a full 6 years, alone at the graveside, unwilling to let go. Think for a moment about what that means. Not a single one of these men had been ordered to mourn him. No law, no king, no religious requirement demanded it. They stayed for 3 years, one of them for 6, simply because of what this one teacher had meant to them, and what he had made of them. That devotion was about to change the world. After Confucius's death, his school scattered. His students went their separate ways across China, but they carried his words with them, and over the following decades they gathered those memories together into a single collection, the Analects, known in Chinese as the Lunyu, meaning selected sayings. Roughly 500 short passages, almost every one beginning with the same simple phrase, "The Master said." The Analects is one of the strangest great books ever written. Open it anywhere at random, and you will find no clear order. A conversation about government sitting right next to an observation about music, a question asked and answered without any explanation of what came before or after. This wasn't sloppiness. It preserved something essential about how Confucius had actually taught. Individually, one student at a time, tailoring every answer to the particular person asking. The book doesn't hand you a tidy philosophy to memorize. It hands you dozens of real moments and asks you to think them through for yourself, which is, in its own way, exactly what Confucius always wanted from his students in the first place. For a while, it looked as though this legacy might be destroyed entirely. More than 2 centuries after Confucius died, a new emperor named Qin Shi Huang unified China for the first time under a single ruthless government, favoring a harsh philosophy called legalism, which held that only strict laws and severe punishment, not virtue, not ritual, could hold an empire together. Distrustful of scholars who might use the old philosophical traditions to question his authority, the emperor ordered the mass burning of Confucian texts. and according to tradition, had hundreds of Confucian scholars buried alive. It should, by every reasonable measure, have been the end of the story. It wasn't. Enough copies survived, hidden in walls, memorized by heart, smuggled from household to household, that when the harsh Qin dynasty collapsed only 15 years later, Confucius's teachings came back stronger than they had ever been before. The dynasty that followed, the Han, deliberately built its entire government around Confucian values, in pointed, deliberate contrast to the cruelty of the regime it had replaced. In 136 BC, an emperor of the Han officially established the 5 classics as the core curriculum of imperial education, and decreed that candidates seeking government office would be tested on their mastery of these very texts, the same texts Confucius had spent his final, humble years quietly compiling and editing, with no idea any of it would ever matter this much. This was the moment Confucius became, in a very real sense, immortal. His philosophy was no longer merely one option among many competing schools of thought. It had become the official foundation of the largest, longest-lasting government in human history, a civil service examination system that would determine who held real power in China for the next 2,000 years, based not on noble birth, but on knowledge and merit, exactly as Confucius had always insisted it should be. His influence didn't stop at China's borders. Over the following centuries, Confucian ideas spread outward across all of East Asia. Korea adopted Confucianism centuries before it was even a unified country, and the Joseon dynasty, which ruled from 1392 all the way to 1897, made it their official state philosophy, arguably even more strictly, in some respects, than China itself ever had. Japan absorbed Confucian ideas alongside its own native Shinto beliefs and Buddhism, and during the long era of the samurai, Confucian ideas about loyalty, duty, and proper relationships helped shape the entire ethical code of Japan's warrior class. Vietnam, too, under centuries of Chinese influence, adopted the same examination system and studied the very same classical texts. Independence from China, when it finally came to these nations, never meant independence from Confucius. His ideas had become quite simply part of what it meant to be an educated person anywhere in East Asia. There's a quiet irony worth sitting with here. Confucius spent his entire adult life trying to convince kings and dukes to rule with virtue instead of force, and almost every single one of them turned him away while he lived. He never got the political power he had spent decades chasing. What he received instead, through nothing but patient teaching and the fierce devotion of a handful of students who refused to let his ideas disappear, was something far larger and far more lasting than any single kingdom could ever have been. He didn't conquer an empire. He shaped a civilization. Even in the 20th century, when China's ancient examination system was finally abolished and a new government arose that officially rejected Confucian tradition as old-fashioned and backward, even destroying temples and burning classical texts during a period known as the Cultural Revolution, the ideas themselves proved far harder to erase than any single institution ever could be. Respect for elders, the seriousness of family bonds, the belief that education could lift a person beyond the circumstances of their birth. These quiet convictions did not vanish simply because a government declared them obsolete. They lived on in millions of ordinary homes, in habits and attitudes so deeply woven into daily life that most people who held them had never even read a single page Confucius wrote. So, was Confucius a success or was he a failure? By his own standards, sitting alone with his grief near the very end of his life, he might well have told you he had failed. No king ever built a government the way he had hoped. No lasting position of real power was ever truly his for long. He watched, again and again, across 14 years of walking, doors close in his face. And yet, here you are, more than 2,500 years later, hearing his story. Here is something worth carrying with you. Changing the world doesn't always look like winning. Sometimes it looks like an old man surrounded by an angry crowd, calmly playing music instead of panicking. Sometimes it looks like a starving traveler, still teaching his students about integrity even while his own stomach is empty. Sometimes it looks like nothing more dramatic than a person who keeps learning, keeps trying to do the right thing, and keeps teaching. Quietly, patiently, without applause, year after year, even when it feels like absolutely no one is listening at all. Confucius never got to see what his life's work would become. He never knew that his students' devotion would carry his words across a fallen empire, through a book burning meant to erase him completely, across 2,500 years and thousands of miles, into homes and schools and governments on the other side of the world, from the small, poor town where he was born. He simply kept teaching, and it turned out that was enough to outlast empires.